Inside Florida Politics, powered by the USA Today Florida Network. Governor Ron DeSantis opted not to meet with Joe Biden during the president's tour of hurricane damage in Florida this week. Hurricane Milton and Helene could disrupt voting in many areas of the state, and the presidential candidates have largely skipped Florida during this cycle. Hello, I'm USA Today campaign reporter Zac Anderson, and those are some of the stories I'll be discussing with Gannett State Capitol reporter John Kennedy and Palm Beach Post politics editor Antonio Fins. Hello, gentlemen. Well, Antonio, this has been really a brutal October for Floridians with back-to-back hurricanes, and that's brought back-to-back visits from the president, who was in Taylor County in the Big Bend part of the state earlier in the month. And then this week, he came to St. Pete Beach to tour the damage from Hurricane Milton, ostensibly, although I think a lot of the damage was actually storm surge damage from Helene. I noticed a bipartisan reception for Biden in St. Pete Beach. Anna Paulina Luna, the Republican congresswoman from that area, stood right with the president as he spoke to reporters that day. Biden also met with Rick Scott, the Republican U.S. Senator who's running for re-election. He's in a tough race right now earlier in the day. But one person who wasn't there was Governor Ron DeSantis. And DeSantis also didn't meet with Biden when he came to the state earlier to tour hurricane damage. That wasn't the case, Antonio, a few years ago when Biden came for Hurricane Ian down in Fort Myers. DeSantis went to meet with him then. What do you think has changed since then?
Well, what's changed here is who's up for re-election and political strategy. If you are Anna Paulina Luna, who was elected in the 2022 midterm election, she's up for election this year. Remember, she occupies a seat that was formerly held by Democrat Charlie Crist, and she's occupying a seat in a district, in a county that Biden carried in 2020. So although Anna Paulina Luna is, full MAGA, I mean, she is completely aligned with former President Trump and his political movement. She is running in a very much a purple area. So the fact that she's there with the president, given that she's in a competitive race, although the Cook Political Report has it solidly leaning Republican, she is running a competitive race against Whitney Fox, who is a former marketing communications director for the Pinellas Transit Authority, she's got some roots in the community. So this is a good opportunity for Anna Paulina Luna to basically maybe purple wash herself. So, appeal to some of those independents, even though it appears, that she's in a fairly comfortable spot. Why take chances? Same thing for Rick Scott.
I mean, that is one of the more competitive congressional races in the state, though. I mean, she might have an edge, but she faces a pretty strong candidate who's raised a lot of money in a district that has, elected Democrats in the past.
Yeah, same thing for Rick Scott. Look, he never wins races by wide margins. Again, it seems to be, all the polls show him having a 1 to 2 percentage point lead. This is an opportunity to show yourself as somewhat bipartisan, a little bit more purple. No one's going to question Rick Scott's MAGA credentials or his hardline Republican or hard right positions. No one's going to question his credibility in that regard. This is an opportunity to basically show yourself to independents and to say, hey, look, I'm on your side. And by the way, it is a massive hurricane. People are suffering. You don't want to look as you're indifferent to the suffering of people in your own state. On the other hand, Governor Ron DeSantis, he's not up for re-election, and he's still trying to work his, basically rebuild his MAGA, his Trumpian, the credibility with that crowd, get himself back fully in line with them. So who's Trump's public enemy number one? Well, it's Joe Biden. So you don't want to be seen with Biden. Whereas 2 years ago, when the governor was up for re-election right after Ian, this is where you want to be seen. Is you're working bipartisan to get the job done. At a time where you're up for re-election, you want to sort of appeal to people in the middle. So I think it kind of speaks less maybe to personalities and more does to strategy. But then also, to a lot of the partisanship that still exists in our politics, and particularly in the state.
Yeah, and Hurricane Ian, John, hit in September of 2022, just 2 months or a month and a half before DeSantis was up for for re-election. So you think, John, that maybe he was a little bit more willing to appear with Biden at this point? I think Antonio makes a good point that DeSantis seems leery of upsetting Trump any more than he has after challenging him in the primary, and that appearing with Biden could really trigger Trump, especially when Trump right now is trying to make these hurricanes. He's trying to really claim that that Biden and by extension Harris are not doing enough to help with storm victims.
That's right. And when you think about it, Trump has tried to make a case, particularly in North Carolina, a battleground state, that the federal government has been slow in its response and ineffective in trying to help victims of the hurricane there. So here DeSantis in Florida, he doesn't want to show up at a Biden event, evidently, that would in any way sort of bolster the credibility of the federal government right now. So DeSantis is playing that Trump card and trying to kind of further echo the whole themes that are coming out of Trump, which is that Biden is an ineffective leader, and you're going to get more of the same with Kamala Harris.
Yeah, and I was at the event that Biden had in St. Pete Beach. I did notice that Kevin Guthrie, who's the director of the Florida Emergency Management Office, was at the event. And when I asked the governor's office why DeSantis didn't show up, they pointed to the fact that Guthrie was there, and they said that the executive office of the governor was represented. But there's a big difference between Guthrie being there and DeSantis. Up next, could the hurricanes impact voter turnout in Florida? Well, between Helene and Milton, much of the west coast of Florida has been damaged by hurricanes over the last month or so. And that has also impacted voting potentially in the state. There's voting infrastructure that potentially has been damaged. It's also disrupted people who are going to vote and might have impacted their ability to vote. John, how do you think that could affect the election in this state? This is a state that has dealt with hurricane disruptions before elections. The election supervisors in Florida do have experience with this, but this could be a fairly major disruption when you consider how much damage we've suffered across the state.
Well, the hurricanes may play a role, given how close we are to the elections. Perhaps the closest thing to an analysis that I've seen was ABC News did a breakdown comparing how Trump and Biden did in 2020 in the counties that were hit by hurricanes Helene and Milton. And it showed that Trump had won 53% of the vote in those counties compared to 46% for Biden. And Biden, of course, did better in the non-disaster counties. So, does that mean that Trump's people this time around are more directly affected by these storms? And could that disrupt their voting plans? It's kind of hard to say at this point. But, overall, my hunch is that I think the partisan divide may be something of a wash, given that some red counties, like you mentioned, Zach, Sarasota, Manatee, and, throw in Pasco County as well, they were hit hard. But then some blue-leaning places like Hillsborough and Pinellas, that's, Tampa and St. Petersburg, they also endured some damage, as did Orlando and Orange County. Those are all kind of Democratic centers in this state. So I think it's kind of hard to say if the hurricanes favor one party or the other at this point when it comes to affecting voter turnout. But, Florida being Florida, well, we have a history of hurricanes, as we pointed out a moment ago, that in 2022, Hurricane Ian devastated some of the state's reddest areas, Southwest Florida. And you remember Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, he won re-election just weeks later.
Yeah, it didn't seem to hurt DeSantis too much. He won by a historic margin, 19 percentage points. So, if you're talking about that was, Republicans really count on Southwest Florida to boost their margins, and he still seemed to do fine, even though that area was hit pretty hard. Yeah.
So the voters he needed didn't stay away, evidently. And looking back a little further after Hurricane Michael in 2018, then Governor Rick Scott was running for the U.S. Senate. And what turned out to be a recounted narrow victory over a longtime Democratic U.S. Senator Bill Nelson. But Scott, after that hurricane, he'd approved allowing some of the rural panhandle counties to create these mega voting centers where people could go to cast ballots. But a low turnout resulted in some of those Republican-leaning counties where people were just unable to drive to the voting polls, and or they didn't know where they were. So we're dealing with some of those concerns again. Election supervisors just this week asked that another 7 counties be added to the 13 counties that were hit by Hurricane Helene. And they want some election flexibility. DeSantis had approved that for the 13 counties, and he's expected to probably add some of these, variants going forward here in another executive order. But consolidation of polling places, changing with the deadlines and access to mail ballots, that's been approved, and that's probably going to be expanded here to the counties that were hit by Milton. But, just like he did after Hurricane Ian, though, I think DeSantis did learn a lesson from what happened with Scott, and he steered clear of that Scott idea of creating these mega voting centers. Those are not part of the mix anymore, and they weren't after Hurricane Ian either. Still, it's likely we're going to wind up with 20 counties. That's almost a third of the state that are given approval to make some changes in Florida's election laws. And, now will voters show up? Or will they take the time to mail in a ballot while they're also waiting for the debris truck to pick up their household items? I mean, these are the kind of unknowns we're facing right now. And, I'll just say, too, remarkably, in North Carolina, that true battleground state, the Trump campaign asked for a host of election changes intended to encourage voting in that hard-hit state. And North Carolina's legislature has adopted many of the changes intended to help both in-person and mail-in voting, but Trump wanted even looser rules. So, this from the man who, after years of railing without evidence about stolen elections, when it comes to a battleground state where his future may be decided, Trump apparently doesn't have a problem with relaxing voting laws.
Antonio, John made the point that there's both red and blue areas of Florida that have been affected by these hurricanes. So if you're looking at how turnout could be affected, it has a purple impact, if you will, on the state because, Democrats and Republican strongholds have been impacted. If you look at, there's been damage in St. Petersburg, Tampa, Orlando, which are all more Democratic leaning areas. But I was talking to a Republican, a pretty prominent Republican in the state over the last week. And this individual mentioned to me that they thought that the most severe damage was really in Republican areas. If you look at the storm surge damage, which really affected coastal areas from, Cedar Key all the way down to Naples, you have a lot of Republican voters in some counties north of Tampa. John mentioned Pasco, but you also have Citrus and Hernando counties that were impacted by storm surge, and then Sarasota, Manatee, all the way down to Lee and Collier counties. And this individual was telling me that they thought that could impact the Senate race in particular. If you look at Rick Scott has never won a race by more than a percentage point. And, he's always in these close races. If Republican voters are disrupted by these hurricanes and it's a close race, that could potentially affect him. If you look at the spending, it doesn't look like he's sweating it right now. He hasn't put as much money into of his own money. He's very wealthy. He hasn't put as much of his own cash into his campaign this cycle as he did the last time. So it's not clear that he's really feeling the heat at this point. But I wonder if you agree with this individual that if any race could be affected, it would be that Senate race.
Perhaps it could numerically. I mean, that's still an outside chance. But the one thing I would point out is that the constant that has not changed in a few months and in years in terms of Republican voters is his enthusiasm. This is not an election where people say, well, if I don't vote this time, I'll vote the next one around. No, a lot of the rhetoric in this election is that this is the last one, that that both sides
Yeah.
are a threat to democracy, that the stakes are so high. And we are living in the Trumpiest, as we talked about, the quote unquote Trumpiest state in America. This is Trump and this is the MAGA state. And I think people will, pardon the expression, what is it? Climb over hell and high water to cast a vote in this
crawl
election
across
because it's so
broken
big. Yeah,
glass, whatever it takes
whatever.
to vote,
And
to pull the lever for Trump.
And since the switch from Biden to Harris at the top of the ticket, the Democratic enthusiasm is very strong in this state as well. So again, I think in those blue counties, people will go through great extents to cast a vote in this election. So I think if, numerically, if the voting systems, if the ability to get to the polls or the polls that being there themselves, if those are impacted, yeah, that would have an impact. But in terms of somebody saying, hey, you know what, I got to go clean up the yard, so I'll vote in the next one, I don't see that happening. Everyone I've talked to, they think for whatever reason that this could be the last election of their lifetime. And I think they're going to go cast a ballot. That's everything I've been told by people who are going to vote.
Yeah, it does seem that people are pretty locked in and pretty energized to vote in this presidential race. Whether it matters here in Florida is another question. Up next, the presidential race has been remarkably quiet across the state. Trump was actually in Florida to campaign this week, but his event was focused more on a national audience than a state one. The former president participated in a Univision town hall in the Miami area, really focused on trying to appeal to Hispanic voters nationwide. Univision is carried on television stations across the broadcast nationally. Is he really, trying to whittle away Harris's edge with Latino voters? But other than that event and a rally that Trump had in Doral earlier this year, the visits from Trump and Harris have been very, very. I'm not sure that Harris has visited the state at all since she's become the candidate, and no. Trump, very little either. What do you make of that, Antonio? It seems like the presidential race has largely skipped Florida this cycle. We're not seeing, the campaign spending. It's really just been a fraction. We're usually inundated by television ads here in this state. Mm-hmm. It feels just really quiet on the presidential front heading into the final weeks. Another sign that Florida just really isn't in play.
Yes, well, here's what's going on. I think that this is really a strategic decision. If you're Harris, yeah, the polls show that you are within striking distance. But to actually close that gap, it would be an investment of tens of millions of dollars, upwards of, between $50 million and $100 million.
Right. Well, I think Bloomberg, mayor, the former mayor of New York alone, a billionaire, put in $100 million into Florida in 2020, and Biden still lost the state by 3 points. So that makes you think that Florida is, more than $100 million needs to be invested, maybe $200 million or more just to be close. The polls, as you said, have shown her within striking distance. There was a USA Today poll that had her within 5 points. Other polls have actually had her within 3 points, but you're saying those are a little deceiving just to get it down.
Yeah, but I think even if they're correct, I mean, I don't know if they're correct or not, but even if they are, to close that 3-point gap, that's where you're going to have to spend these huge sums of money. On the other hand, if you look at the polls in the what are often referred to as the battleground states in this election, the North Carolinas, the Arizonas, the Pennsylvanias, the Wisconsin and Michigan, they're neck and neck. An investment of millions of dollars in those states gets you to 270. Yeah, you can invest $200 million here and maybe still lose by 2%, 0.2% of the vote. Whereas in those states, like a major investment gets you to 270. So I think that is a calculation that the Harris campaign has made. The calculation the Trump campaign is, well, look, we basically we're holding court here. If she wants to come close the gap, then we'll make a decision. But right now, we're going to spend that money and campaign in those states. Now, talk to Jamie Harrison, the chair of the DNC. And when they're talking about Florida being competitive, what they're really talking about is that you're going to drive that you have all this enthusiasm since Harris jumped in the race, where they signed up these 40,000 volunteers across the state. The fact that you got the Florida Democratic Party did recruit a candidate to run in every congressional and state house race. That you have a lot of competitive down ballot races for some of these school board seats. That you have these constitutional amendments on abortion and marijuana in particular. They're going to drive a lot of voters. So they're basically, the calculation they are making is that the surge in voters, particularly voters that would vote for quote unquote Democratic leaning type, like the marijuana amendment, or even especially the abortion amendment, where Democrats do poll quite well on across the country and in Florida, that grassroots enthusiasm is what's going to make Florida competitive. Now, the keyword is competitive versus winnable. Can you really win Florida, the 30 electoral votes? You look at every political analysis out there, and even when the Harris campaign issues those public memos, none of them mention Florida. Their path to 270 is outside of Florida. So what they're basically saying is that we're going to compete for all these races based on enthusiasm, voter turnout. People are going to vote for the ideas that we espouse, and then hope that they mark our ballots, or our candidates on the ballot. So does that win you? Does that win you more seats in the Florida legislature? Does it help you maybe win one of these two competitive races? The one in Pinellas, the one down in Miami, the seat that's now held by Maria Elvira Salazar. Does that help you? In the Senate race, have maybe Debbie Muckleshout Powell wins. That race gets you a huge get for the Senate. I mean, that's what they're counting about when they say Florida is in play. Right. That's what they're talking about, as opposed to we really think we're going to win those 30 electoral votes.
Right. And John, even though Democrats are saying Florida is in play, they're also kind of downplaying expectations. And they're really saying that a win for them in Florida would be passing these constitutional amendments on marijuana and abortion rights, breaking the Republican supermajority in the legislature, that those are really wins for them.
Yeah, that's where they're hoping to make some inroads. They think that if amendments 4 and 3, to a lesser degree, maybe that's the marijuana legalization, that if those were approved by voters, that would be seen as a Democratic victory, and that would be something that would defy Governor Ron DeSantis, who has come out very vigorously against both of those amendments. In addition, as you pointed out, the Democrats are facing Republican supermajorities in the State House and Senate. They're hoping to eliminate that supermajority in the House. The Senate is still going to wind up being a Republican supermajority, most likely, but they think that they can make some inroads. Those are all rather modest, achievements, really, in the grand political map of things. But talking to Florida Democratic Chair Nikki Fried just this week,
modest achievements, I think, is the Democratic Party of Florida's new motto.
That's their new bumper sticker, right? But I think Fried and Democratic leaders are already looking ahead to 2026. That's when there's going to be a governor's race, and they think that there's going to be a lot of DeSantis fatigue in this state. And they're thinking that if they can show some signs of life in 2024, that this party is back to some degree, at least back off the schneid that it was, just 2 years ago.
I think the problem for them, John. I think the problem for them, John, is that if they don't invest enough to keep Trump's margin down, if he wins by 6 or 7 points, it's going to be harder to get national Democrats to invest even in a governor's race in Florida. So I think that the margin of victory for Trump does matter in the state, and that they need to hold him to a certain level.
And the same with Rick Scott and members of Congress. I mean, if Florida just serves up another, Republican-heavy congressional delegation, which it is likely to do, is that going to matter much to Democrats nationally? Because they're going to lose the bid to take over the House, and by virtue of that, and with the Senate, they're also in trouble. Rick Scott, we were talking earlier about the numbers for Rick Scott, and could they be affected by the hurricanes lately. It's kind of remarkable that Rick Scott, as a politician, when he sees a poll that shows him ahead by 1.5 to 3%, that's not reason for nail biting. Rick Scott has won 2 races for governor and for U.S. Senate by margins no greater than 1.2%. So a 3% victory would be a landslide for Rick Scott.
Yeah, Rick Scott's really the last Republican in Florida not to see his margins go up. So we'll see if this is the election for him. Well, there's a lot going on. We're just a couple weeks from Election Day. We'll be back telling you all about what happened. Really, just another remarkable election here in Florida. That wraps up another episode of Inside Florida Politics. I want to thank our production guru, Rob Landers. Thanks to all of you for listening. We're out of here.